So we will start by looking at and then very quickly progress into the algorithmic viewpoint, and I hope that by the end of this hour we can also sort of try and agree and learn something about more general lessons that can be learned about how to shape machine learning for certain tasks that are in fact quite complex. Yeah. At the same time, I don't have to whisper, right? Okay, good. So, yeah. So this is the attention catcher. The focus here is motivated by a specific behavior, which is particularly eminent in moths, which are these beautiful night butterflies, which are known since the 1 century ago, thanks to the study of Jean-Henri Fabre, who was a sort of man of many interests, but mostly an entomologist, who discovered more or less by accident that female moths can emit a very subtle signal by which they can attract male moths from very long distances, actually hundreds of meters away. So at the time when Fabre discovered this effect, of course he was very much confused about what are the sources of these signals. He hypothesized that could be some electromagnetic radiation, which was sort of the big thing of the time, but eventually discovered by a series of ingenious experiments that the message that is sent from females to males is an olfactory signal. So it's an odor signal made of very small molecules, highly volatile, that we now call pheromones. Pheromones means that they carry a message explicitly. So how does that work? No, I'm going backward. I should go this way. So the female moths typically gather themselves on trees or on crops size. They have glands which are 1 milliliter large, and they emit these odors which are emitted at a concentration of a few nanograms per hour, and then are dispersed in the atmosphere, carried away by the wind. And males, which typically are situated hundreds of meters away, receive this olfactory signal. The turbulent wind, of course, as you can imagine, mixes this odor, dilutes it, and so that when the signal arrives at the receiver, it's extremely corrupted and mangled by the turbulent flow itself. So in a sense, this is one of probably the most prominent example where the medium really is the message, because the fact that the turbulence produces this very particular patterned signal starting from a relatively plain input is part of the signal itself, which has to be decoded, interpreted, and translated into a strategy that brings the male moth close to the female moth. So there are lots of complexities that I will not address. The fact that odors usually are blends, they are specific to a certain species in order to avoid the unpleasant circumstance by which you travel a kilometer to discover that it's not exactly a moth of your same species. So, and you know that, you might know that moths have very little time to do this, because they basically live in this adult state only a few days, which are devoted exclusively for the purpose of finding a mate. Why the problem is the problem difficult? As you can imagine, please. Sorry, this is the depiction of what the emission of some odor looks like in a reproduction in a laboratory. So even if the odor is emitted continuously, sort of breaks it down in several patches, interspersed by regions where there's no signal at all. So if you sit at a point, say here, and you take the time trace of the odor concentration, you will see long regions of time, long intervals in which you get no signal at all, and then a clump of signals in which you can perceive some noise, some noisy information. So the task of the male moth is to decode this very sparse and intermittent information and turn it into information about where the female is. To add complexity to this situation, this is the statistics of time intervals between two different signals that an insect can perceive when it is at, say, from tens to hundreds of meters away from the source. And as you can see, there is a very wide range of timescales involved in this process. Some periods between signals could be as long as minutes. And in certain situations, two successive signals could just be apart from milliseconds. So clearly, the task of decoding the information and turning it into an effective search strategy requires both at the same time memory and planning. Because the moth will find itself, for sure, into some sort of desert of information for very long times. There could be tens of seconds in which there is no signal. Of course, getting no signal is information of a sort, but getting a signal is a better information. So the agent must move around and collect information and progress towards the source. How does it do it? So this is a slide taken from, I guess, the most ingenious experiments that I know of in this field. And it's pretty old, as you can imagine, because nobody dares to repeat it again. So here, the researchers, we're talking about 93, right? The researchers sat on a tower, 25 meters high. They took moths from glowing paint, and then they took VHS videos and tracked by hand dozens of them. At the same time, in order to know how the wind is flowing, they released soap bubbles here, and they tracked the soap bubbles. And so you can see here that this is the direction of the mean wind. These small arrows are the local direction of motion of the bubbles, which sort of act as proxies for the odors emitted by the female. So here there was a real female put there, which was emitting pheromones. And then the male started here, and they were tracking. So you can see clearly that there is a pattern of search which is made by some stereotyped movements, which are these casts, which are large excursion crosswind. So the wind is blowing in this direction, and they move crosswind for large excursions. Then these are followed by periods of time in which the moth is going upwind against the wind, and then another cast, and then upwind, a small cast, upwind, cast. Okay, so this is the sort of phenomenological description of how the moths decide how to move in space and how to fly in order to reach the female. How are these phases of motion connected with actual detections is not obvious to make a connection. The simplest model posits that when there are contacts with odor pockets, which are transported by the wind, then the moth surges, and when it loses contact with the odor, then it starts casting. But it's far from being a very well established fact in practice. So from now on, we just leave the realm of biology, and just we take inspiration from this kind of problem, which obviously is a very difficult task. And it's a task which is characterized by the fact that information is very sparse. And it's a task which is also connected to the fact that you don't need only to learn where the female is. The male moth is not sitting here and collecting information and saying, okay, fine, the female is 100 meters upwind of me and 200 meters on the left. That doesn't really matter for the task. You also have to move. You also have to reach the source. And possibly you want to do it in the shortest possible time, because there are other moths around which want to do exactly the same thing. Okay? So there is a push, a strong evolutionary push to optimize this problem. So now we, like I said, we leave this introduction, and we try to rephrase all this problem in terms of algorithms and decisions. And in order to do so, now we really take a very, very broad viewpoint, and we sort of try to describe the kind of tools that are needed to describe this process in the most possible general terms. And the language in which this kind of processes, behavioral processes are described, the mathematical language, is the one of partially observable Markov decision processes. There's a Markov missing, but I will add. So, in very general terms, in every decision process, you can partition the universe into 3 compartments. One is the environment, which is everything that is outside. Outside of what? Outside of the agent, which is the individual, in this case, which makes decisions. And then there is an interface between the environment and the agent, which is called the sensory-motor interface. Any exchange of information, any action between these 2 compartments happens across this interface. So in a mathematical description, you want to assign a certain variable for the state of the external environment. This might be an enormously large high-dimensional variable. We will see in the following what it means in the context of olfactory search. And at the same time, you may want to assign an internal state variable, which describes everything that is inside the agent. Ideally, this, for a human, could be the state of the brain or the full physiology of the being. So it might be something enormous in general. So how does the interaction between environment and agent proceed with time? There are many ways to formulate this. I will just pick one, which is particularly simple. The state emits an observation. So the environment can be observed only partially by the agent through some input. This input is the thing that comes on your sensory interface. For humans, it's vision, it's all senses. Okay, everything that comes in is called an observation. And clearly, it's a very partial representation of the full entirety of the external world. But still, this is something on which the agent has to rely to base its own decisions. Based on this observation, the current observation, a snapshot of the current state of the world that the agent gets, and its own internal state, the agent makes a decision, which formally is expressed as an action, which again could be a very complex vector. The important thing is that this action has consequences, and the consequences of the action is that the environment changes upon an action. Or, to be more precise, what changes is the relative state of the agent and the environment as a result of any action. Okay? So for instance, if there were sweets, they disappeared. I wanted to base my example on sweets. They're on the desk. Wow. So I felt the smell of some very good bougie down there. So as a result of my perception and as a result of the fact that in my memory I like those very much, I will take an action and I will approach this. Okay? So this is sort of, as a result, the relative position of bougie and myself has changed, which is the new state of the environment with respect to the agent. But at the same time, this new experience that is being accumulated must be somehow used to construct a new internal state. You want to keep memory of what happened in order to base your future decisions on an accrued informational state. So as you can imagine, this kind of setting is extremely general and can describe basically every intelligence that I can think of, provided you allow for sufficient generality of what these quantities mean in mathematical terms. How does the agent choose actions? It chooses them according to some objective. And specifically, the objective is that at every single step of this process, the agent incurs some cost or receives some rewards. These two languages are equivalent. Okay, one is the opposite of the other. And the objective of the agent is to make decisions that, in the long run, will minimize the sum of costs in the future, or will maximize the sum of rewards to be incurred in the future. So this is the very general setting. As such, it encompasses many notions which are relatively well known. So we will just go through a slide in which we use some terminology that clarifies, I think, several aspects. So first of all, if the memory is void, okay, there's nothing in the internal state. If you look at the previous, I should do this. If you look at this previous image, if the memory is void, you can only base your action on the current observation. And in this case, I'll never get to that, the strategy that the agent is taking is called reactive. So based on the current observation of the world, it reacts immediately and has no memory. Of course, this is very inefficient. For instance, for olfactory search, such a strategy would be a failure, because if you find yourself in a situation where there's nothing to be informed around, how could you possibly, on the long run, plan some search strategy? So memory is important, and reactive strategies can only capture a very small set of possible decision-making processes. If the agent were to observe exactly the state of the environment in its entirety, then this would be the case which we call perfect observability, which is never the case, essentially, except from some very toy situations, toy model situations. And again, as a corollary, which is very important, and which bases the theory of Markov decision processes, if a system is perfectly observable, then reactive strategies are sufficient, because this is the Markov property of the system. If you observe the state, the Markov property means that that knowledge is enough to predict in probability what will happen in the future. So you don't need memory if you're perfectly observable. But since you're almost never perfectly observable, you typically need memory. And in most tasks, if the observability is very low, you will need a large memory to account for that. In the situation where the transition and the observation probabilities, yes? Yeah? No, because the state of the system is where the source is. And this is unknown to you. That's why it's a very abstract notion. It's the position of the searcher, it's my position, and in that case I can decide, of course. As it's said here, if you know something about the dynamics of the system, if you know how the system transitions to another state, or how your observations come in a certain state, then you can plan. That is, you have analytical tools or numerical tools to predict what will happen in the future, because you have a model, and you can use this prediction in order to optimize your future behavior. This you can do even if you're partially observable. Of course, computationally it's a much harder task to predict, to make plans in presence of uncertainty. But nevertheless, you can plan. What can you do when you don't have this information? You can learn by trial and error. You can repeat trials, keep something as a record, and improve on that behavior. So you replace your a priori knowledge here with some a posteriori knowledge given by experience, and still you can optimize. Okay? So what does this all mean in the context of olfactory search? So again, this diagram. What are the states? So this should probably come earlier for Lorenzo. The states are, for instance, the position of the source, which is unknown, the position of the searcher, which might be known or unknown. So the searcher might know, okay, I'm sitting at a certain point in space, or might not know it. Both possibilities are to be considered. The observations are odor detections, the wind directions, visual cues that the searcher might have. All this contributes to build up a decision making. Actions could be steer in one direction, accelerate, decelerate, change your motion accordingly. Okay, so these are common to all search processes, and in particular to olfactory search. The objective in this specific case is to minimize the time to reach the source in expectation. So it's a very simple task. Go there as fast as you can. The cost, which is just the per step objective, is a unit penalty every time the time goes by and you have not reached the source yet. What is the memory? So this is sort of the beginning of the interesting part, because you could frame this problem with very different memory structures, and some of them have their merits and their disadvantages. And so before going to the final part, where I will sort of try to advocate for one specific approach to memory in these control tasks, we will sort of try to review different approaches that were very popular and used in the past and still are in the language of these partial observable Markov decision processes. And in order to do this, we will, again, in the spirit of insulating the algorithmic part from all the complexities of the real olfactory search. Even if you deal with a robot, there's a lot of complexity in describing olfactory search by a robot. So we will really bring our problem down to the minimum, and we will let our searchers live in a very, very simplified world, which is listed here in detail. So basically, rather than living in the usual three-dimensional continuous world, they will live on a two-dimensional grid. The searcher lives on a grid, and it can only hop on this grid. Okay, it moves just, so for clarity here, we will always use a rectangular grid. So the actions are just the move up, move down, move left, move right on this grid. The state space is just the product of the search space. So what qualifies the position of the searcher at some point, at some time, and the position of the source. The set of observation here again is as a choice, very simplified. It's just binary observation. The agent can feel the odor or cannot feel it. Of course, you can expand on this, but we're trying to build up a very minimal model in order to make sure that nothing is introducing unnecessary complexity in what we want to describe. Memory space and memory state, of course, they depend on the algorithm, and we will discuss. And then these are the properties of the environment, which is very important. For instance, does the source move? Is the female moth moving around? We will assume that it stays in place. Okay, so it's a fixed target search. And how does the searcher control its own motion? Okay, it might be a very erratic moth which decides I want to go upwind, and actually it goes downwind 30% of the time. But we will assume now, again in the interest of simplicity, that the searcher has perfect control about where it goes. If it decides to go up, it really does go up. Okay, and the probability of observations, that is the probability that this is a detection or not a detection, depends just on the relative position between searcher and agent. Okay, so this is our flatland, our reduced grid world on which we are going to discuss all the rest. And from the viewpoint of algorithms, we start with a very simple and classical algorithm, which is called cast and search. So cast and search is an algorithm which tries to translate in decision-making language this idea that when the moth catches a signal, it goes upwind. And then when it doesn't, it starts zigzagging in these prolonged sideways motions. Okay, so the algorithm, as it is defined, is best understood using this diagram here, in which we define these circles here as our memory states. Okay, now, for this algorithm, the memory is made of all integers. The two things can happen: the detection or there is no detection. So the detections here are these circles here. So if there is no detection, what happens is that the memory transitions from 0 to 1. And as it transitions from 0 to 1, the agent goes upwind. Then again, no detection, go to memory 2. But now go right. No detection again, memory 3, and go up. And so on and so forth. As a result, when there are no detections, the agent produces this zigzagging motion with increasingly wider casts. Okay? If it happens that there is a detection, the system transitions to state 0. So in this case, the memory is behaving like a clock. This clock is ticking every time that you don't encounter the odor. If you encounter the odor, clock reset and restart. So this is an example of an algorithm which is biomimetic, so it's inspired by biology. It's model-free in the sense that it doesn't care about what was the statistics of production of detections or which form it had. It just doesn't care. You could put this in any environment, it will do something. But it's not optimized. It's something which is totally hardwired. The rules are defined. I described some rules. I decided some rules. I decided that kind of memory. I decided the rules. And then the agent behaves like that. Question? Yes, in this, yeah, right. That's a good point. In this case, it's understood that the up direction is against the wind, so that the agent has a knowledge of the mean wind direction. That's correct. This is a prior knowledge of the agent. Thank you. Thank you for pointing this out. Okay. Sorry. Yes. Now I'm done. Done. I'm done. Okay. So, yeah. Please. No, you want to understand. In my definition of understanding is when I cast this in an abstract form. I set some constraint on my system. I ask for optimization of a specific objective that is meaningful, and what I observe resembles to some degree what is actually enacted by the agent. You could if you had enough data. So I will hope I could sort of come 3/4 of the circle before the end of the talk. Okay, so clearly this is pretty much a modeling approach. So you decide you want to model this system. I'm describing it in a language that is pretty unusual for modelers, but it is a legitimate algorithm for partially observable markov decision process. You can clearly do better. And one way of doing better is to do what is called Bayesian search. In Bayesian search, the memory becomes a much more complex object, which is a map, basically, which tells at each time where the agent believes that the source is. So you must think that the moth inside its little brain has some structure which works as a map, and the neurons in this map are firing at rates which are larger according to positions where it thinks that there is a high probability of finding the source, and lower in other places. So this is depicted here. Sorry. Okay, so you should think that every time the agent has a knowledge of the domain, and you see here it's colored in according to the color code. There is a high probability that the source is here or here. The agent is here, has been moving around like this, and it makes a detection. And then as a result of this detection, this map is updated into a new map using Bayes' theorem. Okay? And The source, who knows? It's Bayesian. No, the searcher knows that it is exactly, know its position but doesn't know the position of the source, and this is the probability of the source being around black high, white low. Okay? So, yeah, because when you walk on a site and the source is not there, then you can put your belief to 0. Because you have observed that the source is not there, so the belief collapses to 0. Yeah, it could still be in the back. Exactly. But as you move around, then you make a detection, and then the probability that it's in the back, if you measure the ear, is very low, so you kill out all this part of the belief. Okay? So, why Bayesian search, or in general, why the Bayesian approach to partially observable Markov decision process? There are strong information theoretic reasons, because the belief is actually the best way from the viewpoint of information theory, not from the viewpoint of performance, to encode all the past history. Actually, as a matter of fact, you can prove that this belief, this map, together with the position of the searcher, is a sufficient statistic for the full history. So the full history is a long sequence of actions and observations that you made. Now you can compound them in another object, which again is huge. It's not small, but it's a map, and you can act on that. So this is why you could use Bayesian. Other advantage that there are algorithms which can find approximately asymptotically optimal strategies. These can be of different kinds. I do not have time to discuss them, but it's pretty much the extension of what you can do with ordinary Markov decision processes to a much more complex systems in which you have continuous states, etc. In case the algorithmic problem is too hard to be solved, for search there are very good heuristic algorithms that work, which are based on the idea of collecting information around. So again, this is a plus of this Bayesian approach. The minus is that it requires a cognitive map. So, for instance, we know that in certain insects there is a neural structure which corresponds to a map, but we have no idea at all if it is present also in insects. So insects might be doing this job without a map. Of course, since you're doing Bayesian inference, this is something that is always model-based. The only way to go from one belief to the next one is to know these probabilities of observations. You cannot do this kind of approach in a model-free way, and that's a disadvantage. And then there are other technical assumptions that make it also less pleasing. But most and foremost, it requires a very large memory space. It's a probability distribution over all points of this grid. It's a very huge dimensional space. If your search space is continuous, it's even worse. You're going to a functional space. Okay, so it's a little bit of a nightmare to deal with very large memory space. Yep. Yeah. No, exactly. That's correct. That's my... Yes, this leaves a lot of room for my next slide, yeah. Yeah, that's exactly the point. It's optimal from the purely informational theoretical viewpoint in the sense that you're not forgetting anything. No, it is in this specific sense. No, it is in this specific sense of not forgetting anything about the past history. Okay, so in this case, in the sense that this requirement that we just discussed decides how to update your memory. But you could ask exactly the question, can we even also optimize over the way we use memory? In another sense, not in the sense of retaining information, but in the sense that what is the best memory for my task? maybe I'm very much happy to forget something because this improves my performance in that specific task. It will not be good for the set of all possible tasks that I can imagine, but who cares, since we have a very specific objective. So one step in this direction, okay, this is sort of the graphical description. Rather than keeping your optimization on the orange curves here, you want to optimize, which is what Bayesian search does. You also want to optimize over the memory updates, so that all this part which takes place here in orange now is prone to be optimized. And one way of doing this, for instance, is to encode your history not in beliefs but through some device like a recurrent neural network. Okay, so it's a computational device by which your memory and your observations come in. So I'm translating something that in the recurrent neural network language has other names, but it's memory coming in, observations coming in, actions coming out, new memory states coming out, and so on and so forth. So it's a rather natural way. This is a unfolded, unrolled recurrent neural network. In this case, it's an LSTM, but you could have different architectures for this. So this is a quite natural way of implementing a memory in the form of a neural network. Advantages: it's model-free. It can handle graciously sequences produced with extreme complexity, no Markovianity of sequences of observations by themselves. That's fine. Like I said, both decisions and memory updates are learned from data and therefore suited to the task. Of course, it's computationally very heavy to train an LSTM in these complex tasks. The memory space is usually large, maybe not as large as a belief, but usually these cell states are very high-dimensional vectors. In order to optimize all the parameters of the network, you need tons of data, usually. And in the end, it might also be very difficult to interpret. So you might have an object which gives a very good performance in a totally opaque way. And so in order to understand what it does, you have to open the hood and look at some properties of the weights. And this has actually been done recently for this exact problem of olfactory search by the group of Branton at University of Washington. And they did exactly this sort of program, right, using recurrent neural networks. Okay, technical details might be sort of pleasing or less pleasing depending on who it looks, but in the end, what they have to do in the very end is to do PCA on the weights in order to understand what the neural network is doing. Okay, and if they do so, they can identify structures and say, okay, this is the behavior when it has lost the track, this is what is in recovering the track, and this is when it is on track. Okay, so you have to do this work of sort of producing this very big object and then dismantling it to pieces in order to understand what it means. So this motivated us to, and this I'll take the last 10 minutes to close with this. This motivated us to take a shortcut and say, what we just dispense from these very large memory states, memory spaces, and we use minimal memory assignments. And these minimal memory assignments, fortunately, we don't have to invent them. They exist. They've been existing for a long time in old-style artificial intelligence and are called finite-state controllers. Okay, so what are they and why we could be interested in them? So this is a comparison between the different algorithms that I described so far. Okay, so finite-state controllers have discrete memory, pretty states on which you hop, and you're a new memory state at variance with the other ones which are continuous. They can be optimized both in model-based and model-free way. I will explain this in a second, how this is possible. And they optimize both on policy and memory update. And on top of that, the size of this memory space can be very small. It turns out that we can do this task with very small memory spaces, even though it's very complex. So what is a finite state controller? It's a very simple object. In this case, there are two memories. This memory, which has a color which I don't dare to to say what it is. It's greenish and red. So depending on the observation, which could be no observation, observation, the finite-state controller decides what to do. With a certain probability, it will go back to red and maybe execute some movement to the right with a certain probability, or to the left in another probability, or maybe transition to green. Okay, it's a diagram which describes a sequence of memory states, transitions between memories, and actions in physical space. So in a sense, you could interpret this, the presence of these states as internal state, which when they are coupled with an observation result in some behavioral pattern. So this is the mathematical description of this. So how do we optimize this? Well, it's actually pretty straightforward. So this is a sample path of what could happen to a search if the states are red, yellow, and green. So at every time, you should have over the task, sorry, to optimize a function which is called the policy in the language of reinforcement learning, which maps memory state and observations into some action. So what you do in practice is that you parameterize this policy with a certain set of parameters. Usually there's few of them, something like 20 parameters to optimize over. And then you find the minimum of the expected search time by using standard techniques from reinforcement learning, which are policy gradient methods. So basically, what happens here is that you can compute the closed expression for the gradient in the model-based case, and therefore do gradient descent, sorry, ascent, no, descent if it's cost, ascent if it's reward, and find the optima. If you did not have a model, you could do stochastic gradient descent, and you would be learning model-free as well, please. The action depends on the combination of memory state and current observation. The two of them coupled together. So you do different things. You didn't define? No, that's all you have. That's all you have. And you start with the diagram which could connect this into this with any possible probability. Yeah, the number of memory states will be there. Yeah, 3 or 4 maximum. Okay. These are abstract memory states. They have no interpretation whatsoever beforehand. We're going to optimize, and then we look at those, and we're going to give them names. We're going to look at what are they doing. No. This is totally abstract. No. That's a good point. That's an important point. These are totally abstract memory space which have no meaning whatsoever. Only after optimization, when we look at behavior, we will see what they are doing. And in order to show this, so this is a single slide which has a lot of information, but I hope I can walk you through this. This is the optimal 3-memory finite-state controller for the olfactory search task. Okay, so this is what emerges from optimization. So what are these 3 states doing? The green state basically always goes up, and it goes into itself quite a lot, and with a small probability can transition to the yellow state, and the yellow state goes sideways and a little bit backward, and then it can hop onto the red state, which goes the other way around. All this happens if you have no detections. If you have detections, everything is resetted to the green state. So what is this finite state controller doing? It's doing search and cast. We didn't put this by hand. Okay, it was a result of optimization. You can see this from a trajectory. It starts, it makes a detection, it goes up, then it transitions to yellow, goes to the right and a little bit down, and then transitions to red, to the left, and then again you see this alternance of red, green, yellow, red, and then eventually shot back to yellow, to green in presence of a detection. So here you see a longer trajectory in which this takes much longer to get to the source. It even hits on the side boundaries here. But you see that the pattern is essentially doing this cast with a retrograde motion in the yellow phase, which is the one that allows you to recover the source if you overstepped it by chance. And here you see the occupancy maps of these memories. So this means that the green memory is essentially active here and a little bit here. So basically it's telling you when you are here, you are very likely to be in the green memory and you're very likely surging, which makes sense. And the other two are active when you are away from the source on the sides. And you have sort of entered this recovery mode, which brings you back close to the axis of the wind. Give me a little bit more. This question, would you like to have 2 memories or would you like to have 4? 2. We tried with 2, but it does a very simple thing, which is, I didn't show it. It does surge and then a backward random walk. Right, right. Because the rates here are set by the optimization. So when you optimize, basically the agent has a sense of which is the width of the domain, and it knows that it has to hop from one to the other with a time scale that is comparable to the size of the space that it has to span. Okay, so when you optimize, there are also suboptimal maxima of the optimization, or minima if you're thinking of costs, which have a different structure. For instance, this one has more of a linear structure. It's more of a clock in the sense that it starts green and it's again a surge state. Then it transitions to this magenta one, which goes a little bit like a random walk, but along the wind, up and downwind, with a slightly larger component downwind. And then if again there are no detections, then it goes in full panic mode and it starts doing a backward random walk. Okay. So when you have 2 memories, basically there's just this one and this one surviving. You see that again they are activated in different positions. In particular, the magenta memory, which is the one of the backward random walk along the wind, is very active up of the source, which is meaningful. Also on the edges of the source. So it's sort of like I just lost track of the plume, and then I will do some sort of backward backtracing in place, a little bit of back up, and then start, if nothing works, start again this. And you see that over time, there is this sequence of occupations, green, then magenta, then purple, etc. So you will not be surprised to know that if you work with 4 memory states, it's just a mix of these 2 before, so it gets a little bit of the best of the 2. And what happens is that you have a sequence of surge, then backward random walk, surge and cast, and you see that the backward random walk is active, very active on the edges and upwind. And you see also that there is one interesting observation that we had is that these diagrams are always asymmetric. If we symmetrize them by force, they are suboptimal. So in some sense, our virtual moths are all left-handed or right-handed. They tend to go through this process through one of them and then hop like this. You see, red before yellow. We have no idea why it happens. I mean, this is a symmetry. The system is completely symmetric by construction. The symmetry is just broken by the optimization process, and there are two equivalent maxima, but the symmetrized version is not optimal. I have no idea why it happens, or if it has any meaning. But that's what it is. So to close, so this is how it looks when it is doing its thing. This is in a real data of odor taken from an experiment with flies, which I don't have time to talk about, but you see that it's a sequence of events. Okay. So yeah, okay. Performance, you can make comparisons. The only thing I want to say is that, of course, there is a price to pay with respect to algorithms like infotaxis, which are Bayesian algorithms. There's a at least a factor 3 to pay with our 4 memory state, and you see that also the price to pay is that there are very long attempts that are not successful with respect to the Bayesian algorithms. But again, here we work in with the 4 discrete states rather than with an object which is in a space of dimension 10,000. Okay, so it's I think it's a fair price to pay. Conclusions: finite memory controllers, despite what you would not expect, are expressive enough to represent rich behavioral patterns. They can encode for approximate clocks or approximate maps, as I tried to show you. They are easy to optimize because there are few parameters. You can do this model-based or model-free, depending on what you know about your system. Have an immediate interpretation. Okay, you just optimize and then you look at these things, and they tell you what they are doing. Of course, they might not necessarily work for all tasks, but it's nevertheless, I think, impressive that in such a complex task they can perform such a job. And this is the sort of the missing 25% of the talk. One should definitely go back to a neuroscientist and ask, are there modules in the brain that have neural correlates of these internal states? The ball in that field. No. Okay, thank you. Sorry for being too long.